There's not going to be time to talk about all the questions in the survey during our panel, so we're just going to focus on a couple of big themes that have come up, and so we'll tackle these one by one. The first one is going to be the issue of objectivity or impartiality. One of the reviewers said, one of the respondents to the survey said, in response to check your bias at the door, a question which kind of fascinated me, because for years I had a cartoon from the New Yorker posted by my desk showing a very stern school teacher looking at a very mad boy who was holding a paper with an F on it that said, "I'm sorry I didn't respond to the material." It's hard for me to imagine myself as a practicing critic as an objective machine, as an impartial machine. And so, although, of course, we need to follow some kinds of guidelines here. So I wanted to begin by asking Maureen, who's such a prolific and tremendous reviewer, how do you think about this issue of trying to be objective or fair or impartial, and where do you try to negotiate those?
Yeah. Well, I think objective is different from fair and impartial. Somehow they all have different connotations to me. My gut reaction hearing you read that question and the response again, check your check your biases at the door, is why would you want to read a review that was so cleansed of any biases that it sounded like it was written by an automaton? I think if you try to be clear as a reviewer about your own biases, your own predilections, etc., and possibly, if you've got the time, to make them explicit in the review, that makes for a much more interesting review. I read reviews to get the sensibility of the critic, to enjoy watching their mind at work on a piece of literature. John Leonard, who we're honoring, right, at the NBCC, and who was my predecessor at Fresh Air, and who I revere to this day, he was a great champion of Toni Morrison. He accompanied Toni Morrison to the Nobel Prize Award, right? And he still reviewed her afterwards. I didn't expect to hear a negative review from him of Toni Morrison, but I wanted to hear what he had to say about the latest Toni Morrison. I wanted to hear his enthusiasm. So I feel like almost every one of these questions that we got in the survey could be answered with, it depends. And this is definitely a question of, it depends. But I certainly wouldn't want to sign on to any kind of contract that required me to leave my biases at the door. My biases are part of what make me, I think, worthwhile as a critic.
I mean, we can certainly think of biases that actually many people would probably frown on, sexism, racism, right? So where do we begin to negotiate perhaps?
I'd point out that we did a panel of this sort in 2007. Leonard was on it, Christopher Hitchens was on it, they're both gone. It could be that, Hacko, the god of book reviews, noting their lack of respect for ethical considerations went after them. They were very disrespectful of the idea, especially Hitch, of codes and things like that. But one of the things I found when I did my original survey was that you really have to pay attention to venue, and I think a lot of people didn't in response to the questions this year too. There is a difference between The Nation and the New York Times. I can remember years ago talking to Arthur Gelb, then the managing editor of the New York Times, about the daily book critic position, and being told that it's something where you should be a kind of everyman. You shouldn't bring your own biases to bear. You would be the reasonable man, as we say in law, or reasonable woman reviewing a book. Now, I don't think it ever plays out that way. I mean, when Dwight the other day reviewed George Packer's book as a near masterpiece and suggested that Packer had America exactly right, as coming apart at the seams, I think that's because he agrees politically with George Packer. Your biases will come out, but I think if there's one thing that should inform the conversation, it's that we can't apply the same rules to lots of different venues. There's a part of the book reviewing world that believes in the quasi-objective review, or at least striving for it, And there's the part that thinks of the book review as a performance, a literary genre, and it's going to have all the biases and aspects of personality that any other work of literature has. Those are two different things, but they're both a part of our world.
Can I just
Of course, please do.
I mean, I think this is like a central point, that different publications have different contracts with the reader. And I think when you go to a newspaper, at least when I go to a newspaper looking for a review, I mean, just because it's part of a paper, I have a different expectation. You know, I want to feel a certain kind of objectivity. There are different reviewers that are more playful. Dwight is one of them. But my expectations are different. And if I go to a magazine, if I go to a place where I can read something associative and essayistic and impressionistic, my needs change. All of our needs change as readers. And I think our needs change when it comes to criticism as well.
Do any of you think it's actually possible to write an objective review or an impartial review? Or what would that look like to try to make yourself move closer to that?
Well, I don't know, objective might not be the word, but impartial might be a good word. It seems to me that one way of factoring in your partiality is to cop to it. And I agree with everything you said, Maureen. My response to a lot of the questions was not just it depends, but tell the reader, be present, own up.
I mean, I think one bias is that I'm always interested in seeing people play with, actually aren't even ideological, it's stylistic. And I like to see reviewers, like Virginia Woolf is one of them, where she creates the space where she says, like, I thought I liked this, and now I think I might like something different, you know? And I think that's a bias that, especially when it comes to fiction, we want to create spaces for appreciation and discover newer writers. And I want to see writers sort of grapple with people doing different things with the form. And that's why I think I love poetry critics so much, because they're constantly, some of them, the best ones, are interrogating their own taste.
Poetry reviewing, of course, also being notoriously full of biases
and impossible. Just impossible.
Yes,
I just want to mention that we often forget when we're thinking of book reviews and we're thinking of bias. We're thinking of adjectives, we're thinking of the evaluative part, but a lot of the bias in book reviews comes in the reporting. It's an important element of a book review, to report the book, to say what happened there. And a lot of people infiltrate their biases in the reporting. So they'll say, commits factual errors throughout the book. I remember once asking one of my reviewers, how many factual errors did you find? 4. How big is the book? About 500 pages. Were they evenly spaced? More or less. I thought that was a distortive sentence, right? But it was a way that the reviewer was trying to attack the author. Another thing that we could do much better in this business in regard to the form of the book review would be to explain a little bit more about the bias or the perspective of the reviewer, either in the ID line or in the body of the text. I often, and just to give you a fanciful example, if you were assigning somebody who wrote a book against ice cream, to review a history of Ben and Jerry or so, you might want to have it in the body of the text that, this person wrote a book, ice cream is bad for kids, it's bad for mental functioning, it's bad for this and that, and you get a sense of why, okay, you might have a very critical view of this business. We don't do that enough. We don't incorporate enough of that information into reviews.
In terms of bias and looking at the results of the survey, it's interesting to note that people got most exercised about what Spy Magazine used to call log rolling in our day, which was friends reviewing friends' books, et cetera, et cetera. What my colleagues and the editors I spoke to got most upset about didn't raise the ripple at all, which is what you're describing. That is deliberately assigning a nonfiction book to someone who works the same side of the street and has a competitive book either in the works. I had a colleague who had a pair of biographers who'd written a book and expressly asked the publisher to please remind the TBR not to send it to this one person who loathed and detested them because they'd scooped this author 10 years earlier on the same biographical topic, got the movies deal, got the bestseller, got the prizes, and they assigned it to that author. And of course, it was eviscerated because this person had a lot of skin in the game. The respondents in the survey didn't seem to be buffed at all by that practice, and that's what drives authors, speeches, editors crazy.
So go ahead, please.
There's one other thing that didn't come up in the survey, that explicitly anyway, that makes me more regularly exercise. And that's when, you might speak into the mic. And that's when a book review editor assigns a novel to a young novelist, because I think that creates a really impossible conflict of interest. How many times has a client come to you and said, the Times has asked me to review such and such, I've got a book coming out. It's not very good, but should I do it? And then you, as the agent or editor, kind of have to say, having the author's interest in mind, yeah, you should probably do it. You should probably be a good citizen. Or, I usually say you shouldn't, but if I were a better person, I would say you should, if I looked after my authors more. I think that happens all the time, and it creates, the person who really suffers is the reader, because it creates a bunch of really tepid, polite reviews that suggest that books that are of no interest are of some interest.
So instead of saving all the audience questions for the end, periodically as we're kind of wrapping up the topic, I'm just going to ask for one question to get some voices in and not save them. So I'd like to point out the topic of objectivity and partiality. Does anyone in the audience have a question? Yes, please.
Yes, are you working on creating any kind of framework or guidelines for what objectivity would be? I mean, it's a term that really doesn't mean anything whatsoever in a field where taste is so important. So how about even breaking out, these are some of the things that should be a part of it, such as, do they cover the subject area? Are there contradictions? Is there a through line? You know, all of these professional rubrics, is there any discussion of that at all? And how would that look?
We're still in the initial parts of, you're talking about the NBCC with their code of ethics, you're saying?
People here, whoever they are, whatever venue, they discuss these things in.
For the code of ethics, I'll say that this is just the beginning of our conversation. So it's good that you raise that, because this is all the kind of things that we're trying to begin considering. What should go in, what shouldn't go in. One of my favorite responses in the survey was, it's okay as long as it's in accordance with the NBC's forthcoming code of ethics. That's like, shoot, okay. That's pretty good. So for
Where
us, it's
you
still
are
in
now,
flux, but perhaps the editors would like to respond to that in terms of when they're dealing with their own authors or the critics.
To follow up on what Lauren said, I think readers of book reviews and even blurbs are pretty smart. And when you read the tepid, polite review written by someone who feels they have to write the review but doesn't want to give offense, you read between the lines and realize I'm being told I don't necessarily need to read this book. There was a situation in which a friend of mine blurbed a client's book, and I read the blurb, and I saw him at a party later and said, "So, I guess you didn't like it very much, did you?" And he said, "What do you mean I blurbed it?" I said, "Yeah, I read the blurb. The blurb was one of those, this is a book." And I think that you're right, it does a disservice to the publication and to the readers to read those sorts of reviews.
Yes, of course.
I mean, I'm so surprised at hearing that, because I never really thought about somebody. I mean, I suppose it does happen, but for me, criticism is its own pleasure, you know? And so I think to miss the chance to write an interesting piece of writing, just for its own sake, is what's done. I mean, I understand that some people feel politic, they feel pressured, but I think for me, as like an editor getting in these pieces, like, you know, that would just come across as like a lazy piece of writing.
That's not what it is, though. It's a tremendous reluctance to displease the book review and a greater reluctance to hurt anyone's feelings. And this is a debate that we have about the idea of putting a book out there and having it completely trashed. On the one side, the book review editor can say, "Hey, you put it out there, you're asking for it. Of course we're going to trash it if it's a lousy book." On the other hand, there's this human being who an agent and an editor have worked with for years on this thing. And they have to wake up in the morning or wake up worse at night and log on and discover this terrible review and sob into their cereal all the next day thinking, "Oh my God, I just wasted 3 years of my life and this person just destroyed it in 600 words." So
This is a perfect segue actually into the next big topic that I want us to cover, which is about personal professional relationships. Where we're starting to talk about thinking about the author's feelings, thinking about the relationships you have with your editor, wanting to impress someone in the future. A lot of the questions, perhaps too many of the questions in the survey, have to do with all the different ways we split the connections between the reviewer and the author. Do you have the same literary agent? Do you have the same publishing house? Have you met them at a party? Are they actually a good friend of yours? In any of these circumstances, when is it okay or not okay to review somebody's piece of work? And to me about that is the ways in which there are cases where we can say this is obvious, but there are also cases that are really, could go either way, or it depends on the circumstances. You know, Randall Gerald reviewing one of his friends is maybe a piece that I want to read. Christopher Hitchens, somebody mentioned as, but yet on the same hand, when we think about that as a general practice, reviews being written by people who they're friends with and being put out to the public, it kind of makes your skin crawl. So to get into some of the details of this, I think that I wanted to quote two things that came out from the review. One of them, in terms of this general practice said, so one of them said, I think that even a very casual acquaintance can inspire undue generosity or vitriol. The other one says, I think the idea that there can be a perfect hermetic seal between authors and reviewers is just an unattainable ideal. That's just not how the books world, or any world, works. So to get into some of those difficulties, I'm going to pass it over to Pearl to talk to us a little bit about a review that she recently read. You know how to pronounce this author's name much better than I do. Is Mohsin Hamid?
Mohsin Hamid.
Thank you, Mohsin Hamid. And in the review, she acknowledged that her family and the author's family are friendly. And so to kind of understand how these dynamics might work, I wanted you to delve into
Okay,
that.
let me just tell you how at least we work when it comes, book review works when it comes to personal and professional relationships. You know, we always ask, do you know this person? Say they come back and they're like, you know, we're casually friendly. We try to get a sense as much as possible. Will you be fair? How much do you think this will influence you one way or the other? You know, and I think by and large, critics, at least, you know, I find are very, very forthcoming about their own biases. That they, you know, I'm not the right person. I don't really admire her work. I should not be the person reviewing this. In the case of Mohsin Hamid, I really wanted to review his new book, and I went in and I talked to my boss and a couple of the other editors, and I told them, you know, when I was 8, for a year, we lived in the Philippines, where Hamid's family also lived for a year, and our families were friendly. And they knew this. I went and I felt very comfortable being fair and sort of as objective as one can be, you know. And then we decided to also just put it in the review. And I think it's, you know, you can acknowledge it, just put it out there, you know. Yeah, when it comes to, as Colin was saying, like, as much as you can put into the review that I've written this book, identify yourself, identify, you know, your biases, your institutional sort of credentials. And it creates a feeling of, you know, trust. I think the reader feels a little bit more like I'm getting, you know, this up front. I'm not having to stay around for it.
So would you disagree with this person who says even a casual acquaintance can make undue generosity or vitriol?
No, I think that's totally true. I think for me, one of the interesting things about criticism, writing it, reading it, editing it, is working through that. I think, and that's why I think criticism feels like a very, I don't know, at least it feels profound to me because of it. I think you're always unpeeling what you think about this writer, what you think about this genre, what you think about this country that this book is even from.
And perhaps because of that connection, you might have actually felt like you were someone who was particularly qualified to understand that book, which was a lot about.
I wish that was the case. I was completely mystified by the book, and I read it numerous times. But I sat with it. Yeah, no. I'm always
wonderful. Please,
Yeah.
Carla.
One feeling I have after years of thinking about this issue is that literary ethics don't take place in a vacuum. They take place in the larger world of ethics. And a book that came to my mind this morning, I was coming down, and somebody could remind me, I'm sorry I didn't check the name. It was that book, very short memoir by the Sri Lankan woman who lost her whole family in the tsunami. The way, yeah. So how do you review a book like that if you think it's bad? I haven't read it. I hear it's wonderful. But how do you review a book like that? This year I did review a book by a Holocaust survivor, a great scholar of the Holocaust who for the first time was trying to write personally about his experience as a child in Auschwitz, and I thought it was terribly done, rambling, not concrete, and so on. How do you write about that? One thing to remember, with the issue of bias is that any bias can be overcome by ruthless honesty. A best friend can write a devastating review of a friend and lose that friendship, you know? And so, you know, no matter what rules we try to create for distance and objectivity, it's the actual behavior in the specific situation that's going to result in either an honest review or a dishonest review. I just wanted to say, to violate the procedure a little bit, to come back to the issue of objectivity. I certainly don't want to suggest that objectivity is not possible or that it's not definable. I think there are lots of ways we can do it. One way, for instance, just to give you one example, would be for a reviewer not always to assume that a position different from the reviewer's is irrational or wrong or vicious or so on. Even if you do assign right wing on left wing on right wing, there's a way to write a review that acknowledges I might be wrong or the other person might have a point, and that's a step toward objectivity.
But Carla, now I just want to jump in. You're not reviewing the Holocaust. You're not reviewing the tsunami. You're reviewing, I mean, you know that. So I don't think that there's really any subject that should put off potential reviewers, because we're reviewing the book, the expression. We're not reviewing the event.
Well, but if you wrote about that woman's book and said, you know, you're such a bad writer, you should have gone under the waves also.
I can imagine Christopher Hitchens.
Every holiday people say, Grandma, you look great. And Grandma looks like she's on her last legs. We're in a larger...
But that's to Grandma. If I were writing about Grandma, I might say she looks like she's on her
No, the issue is of tone, and like what Eric said, he's an agent, he's a champion of his authors, and so he knows the people behind those books, you know. So I think it's you know, a question of how you're making, you know.
One of the interesting survey questions that piqued my curiosity as to the response was this question of, to what you said, refusing to review a book that you hate. That is, being assigned a book, hating the book, and choosing not to review it. I think that's a perfectly valid choice. I think the respondents did too. Am I wrong? What was the
I have done. So
You're right, but they were wrong. I'm not.
And I said this for a couple of reasons. One, because of the...
Would you like the data first?
I love the data, sure.
Okay. Is it okay for a reviewer to decline to review a book that he or she has already accepted for review on the grounds that he or she didn't like the book and doesn't want to say negative things in print? Yes, 62.6%. No, 26.8%. I'm not sure, 10.6%. Some of the people said this should happen more often, frankly. Not unless that option was part of the agreement with the assigning editor, otherwise unprofessional, not to mention cowardly. This trend is absurd. How can you trust a single book review if this goes on? Far too much of this. It's called discretion. I don't think it's right to do this much as a matter of policy, but sometimes you hate a book so much or just find it so boring and so unimportant that you can't think of anything useful, positive, or negative to say about it.
Well,
But as an editor, I would hesitate to assign books to a reviewer who regularly turn things back for this reason. Can I give you a couple more?
Sure.
Just because I think it's interesting for people to hear the responses. I have suggested withdrawing, but never refused to write the review. My suggestion has never been accepted. Not out of charity to the writer, but because it's of more use to readers to review books of interest. Better no review than one that pulls its punches. If you don't want to say negative things in print, why are you a reviewer? This is the key to book reviewing. Any book that gets reviewed must be positive and must be endorsed by the reviewer. Why be nasty if you don't have to? Cowardice in discussion is a crime, but in the case of first novels or small press books, why kill something that will die a natural death? Not a reviewer you should be using if you're an editor. I would call that approach pretty close to best practice. If you can turn down money like that, then more power to you. The only interesting things to say in print are negative ones. Just to show you the range of, there's a yes and no, but
Yeah, I mean,
when you get down to the comments.
As you discussed in the introduction, there's been such a massive decline in column inches devoted to book reviewing in the past 10 years that every review counts so much more than it did even 10 years ago. And I do think that in a bewildering retail environment where there are so many people who are all trying to reach want are reliable recommenders, which speaks also to the question of voice and personality of the reviewer and to consistency, so that when you read a review by someone you know, or hear a review by someone you know, whose recommendations have been right in the past, you credit them more than you would otherwise.
And maybe somebody who's biased you like.
Yes, exactly.
Whose bias slants the same way as yours or challenges yours.
I would argue that because there is so much noise, what people want is to be told what to read. And that's true in conversation with friends. This, friends say, what have you read lately that's good? It's more valuable for them to have you rave about a book that you read and love than it is for you to list the books you read that you didn't love.
But the critics among us, we've all written negative reviews.
Sure.
Right?
There were entertaining negative reviews, I'll grant you that in many cases, unless the review says, oh my god, this is the best book I've read all year, you have to read this.
You know, what Eric was just saying, I think it is in tension with what you said about there being a sort of equivalency between blurbs and tepid reviews, because we do have so few pages, and there are books that need to be shut down. There are bad books that need to be shut down, and I think that's a very important service for a book review to do, and a book review magazine to do. And I've never edited a book review magazine, but it seems to me that nowadays a real problem is that there's so many book reviews where the reader cannot be expected to know the byline, and can't, because they're so short, get a sense of the sensibility. They really can't. The best writer in the world couldn't do it. And unless you have someone like Josh Cohen, who's going to go out and just be a real jerk, brilliantly, I thought, when he was finally asked to review another young novelist who was like him, a young Jewish writer, and he made the review about that problem, then you're going to get a bunch of skippable reviews because they won't mean anything to most of the readers. And it devalues the whole idea of praising an unknown novelist, for example.
And there's also this idea that the review is ideally, I mean, they're not always like this, but more than just an endorsement or a pan, and it is an argument. And I think that people who like reading reviews sometimes are looking for things to read. And there's certain critics that I always go to, and I always want to know, like, what's Laura Miller reading? And like, I'll go and I'll take, you know, and that's what function she serves to me. And there's some reviewers that, you know, I read just because I want to know how your mind works. Like, I want to be in a space with you, creatively and critically. So.
Any other thoughts on the value of a negative review too? I mean, so we have a rule or warrant.
One thing that did come up a lot in the past was the idea of a book review, in the old sense when we had really fleshy, full book reviews, as a liberal education. You know, that book review should be explaining the world as the books explain the world, and so, you know, you need negative reviews to do that. On the professional point, I thought the comment I heard there that made the most sense to me related to the distinction of having set this up with the book review editor, that you will not do it if you don't like the book or if you think it's very bad. That's okay. I remember I had that arrangement with Ann Tyler. She did not want to write negative reviews. I wanted Ann Tyler in my section, so that was okay. But with others, I thought if somebody insisted they would not do the review, I would never use the person again, because it's a professional assignment. You're supposed to cover it, and you made that commitment. And, you know, it's very likely you wouldn't be able to reassign the book, you know, in reasonable time.
And I've certainly had the opposite. I mean, I was given asked to review a book by an editor, and one of Isabel Allende's novels, and I said to him in an email, I said, I don't know that I'm the right person for this. The idea of this makes me taste blood in my mouth. And he said, I think that if you can keep an open mind with the book, but I mean, what am I saying? I mean, I already have blood in my mouth. And so, and I do try to go into, I really do try to go into every book, really trying to understand and have an open mind. But I just don't know how much that's actually possible, even with the best, and I end up taking it apart. I mean, I hated it for all the reasons I had hated so many of her previous books. So, but she's a best-selling author, and so I think that from his point of view, he felt like, let's hear what's the, I mean, she was near the top of their bestseller list in the Washington Post at the time. So
I think the distinction, the debut author, small press distinction is an interesting one. And the term dying a natural death. And in these days, not being reviewed is equivalent to being badly reviewed in the old days.
Any questions from the audience on the negative reviews or on, we were talking about personal and professional relations before. Yes, sir.
Is there an element of a book that you all look for that you consider a bad element?
is there an element of the book that you all look for that you consider a bad element, you said? I have one. I definitely have one. Don't we all have one?
Non-fiction, lack of accuracy, for
Yeah.
I mean, things that's right off the bat feel canned. Yet another book about a dog that doesn't bring anything new to the conversation about dogs. You just know that the book was written because somebody's agent, sorry, or publisher said, hey, dog books are selling. So.
Hey, Eric, no. Eric, do you want to?
Well, since this is all about full disclosure, we did sell the New York Book of Dogs.
Cool. Lauren, do you have things that kind of just immediately?
I don't think I have anything. No, I don't think I have anything to add.
I would say, for me, when I feel like all the good characters are really, really good, and all the bad characters are really, really bad, unless it's parody or satire or just something that if that's just presented as some form of realism, I find that very difficult to swallow.
You just described To Kill a Mockingbird.
I didn't think that book in the 7th grade, and I still don't like it. So moving on, we had so many more things to deal with, but I think we're getting close to the end, so I'm actually going to move to a different one. One of them is, so we've been, as I think we should, kind of sitting in a lot of the gray areas, not so much the yes and no's, but I wonder if there are actually any hard rules. I mean, we're moving towards a possible code of ethics, and so are there any hard rules that we could put out there and say, really, any review worth its salt should try to achieve these things or adhere to these guidelines or rules? So, Carlin, do you want to take a stab at that?
I think one question we had on from the beginning was, is it ever acceptable to review a book without reading the whole thing? Which I then thought had to be expanded to without reading the book, because we had that famous example years ago, some of you may remember Michael Kinsley, not in the reviewing capacity, but I think he was a judge on the National Book Awards and admitted that he hadn't read a lot of the books that he was supposed to read. I do think, in judging prize competitions, it's okay not to read the whole book. If you decide a book is not a contender and you're not writing about it, then you can stop. But I don't think it's acceptable not to read the whole book. I think that's a hard and fast rule. I mean, I think some of the people in our earlier surveys said, if it's an encyclopedia, maybe. That last page could say everything I have written to this point is false, or have some kind of inventive change. So at least I, as a critic, I used to have what I called a pancake pile on my desk of books that were 110 pages, 120 pages, and if I was reading a 600-page biography and I couldn't make my own deadline in my section, I would switch to a short book, because you really have to cover the whole event. And those of you who know, rock music, there have been a lot of critics who have been fired because they actually did not attend the concert that they wrote about. I think this happened to Theodore Dreiser, so it's a long tradition. You really have to read the whole book. That's one hard and fast rule.
I disagree. I mean, obviously, you should almost always read the book. But if you don't read the book, you should talk about why you didn't read the book. And I once tried to do that with a Stephen Carter novel, and I realized that it would be easier just to read the book than to try to come up with a rhetorical explanation of why I didn't. But I shouldn't have read it, in some sense, and it would have been a better review if I talked about not reading the book, I think. Not to beat a hobby horse, but just to beat a hobby horse, it seems to me that you can, anything that's a personal, that sets you apart as a reviewer of the book is something you can talk about in a review. It's the structural things that are hard to talk about, like, I'm a young writer, I'm a good citizen, I'm not a professional critic, I haven't read that many contemporary novels. This seems really luminous to me. You say, well, we know, as an editor, you know when someone's mailing it in. Sometimes people aren't even mailing it in. They're just not critics.
Yeah.
And there's just, in a lot of the book reviews that we have left, that seems to me to happen. That's the real ethical problem in book reviews that we have left for me.
I'd add that the one thing, just get the book right. And I think we fact check like crazy at the book review. We really make a huge effort. Just talk about what the book actually does and be accurate. Don't misrepresent its argument, as you were saying. Don't, exaggerate its flaws. Come correct when that's concerned.
I would say that the simplest boiled out of the whole thing is that there's a contract between the publication, the reviewer on one side, and the reader on the other, of basic honesty. That is, if you have biases, announce them. If you have connections, announce them. Otherwise, don't puff up a book that isn't good, and don't trash a book that is. There's an expectation that when you read a review, it's coming from as close a place of, not objectivity, but fairness, as you said before, as possible. And otherwise, everything else is pretty fair.
And I think one of the first rules of book reviewing is take the book on its own terms. What is the book attempting to do? Don't review it for not being the book that you wanted to write. I'll never forget a TV review I read of The Pacific. Was it Ken Burns or Rick Burns? That documentary on World War II. The TV critic took the documentary to task for not dealing with the effect of World War II in Europe. That wasn't what that series set out to do. It was exploring 4 places in America and the effect of the war on the home front. It was loony. If I had been an editor, I wouldn't have let that review run. That's not what that work was trying to do. That's a TV review, but I think the same rule applies to book reviewing.
Yeah, so let's open it up to a few just general questions. It doesn't have to be about this. So, yes, please.
Just adding on to what you said, as you're assigning reviews, is it important to take into consideration finding a reviewer that has the same culture, that understands the audience that this book is trying to reach? You were mentioning the Stephen Carter book, and I don't think, were you the right person to review Stephen Carter? And I say this because I was formerly the associate publisher of Black Issues Book Review, and we found this over and over and over again, that white reviewers were reviewing Black authors that had no understanding of the cultural context into which those authors were writing, and they were often panning them. When the street fiction first came out, the reviewers had, they were trashing the books, saying that they were trash. They weren't all trash. Some of them were really well-written books, but they were creating a new genre. So how important do you find it to make sure that the reviewer has the cultural sensitivities that of the audience or the author?
Paul, since you do a lot of assigning, do you want to kick off on that one?
It's so hard because it's like you even if you find the right person, the best possible person, you don't know what they're going to do. So you kind of, there is like a sort of like alchemy or sort of like just tossing things in a pot and seeing what happens. So no, there's a huge amount of effort goes into trying to find somebody who is qualified to write about something, but as we were saying before, this issue of being competitive, and there's some writers when you assign like a review to somebody who's in the same field and they are very supportive and interested and encouraging, and there's some that feel, territorial, or they might be unfair. So there's only so much control you can have over the review that you finally get in. But we do put a lot of thought and care into that.
I have to say, as a reviewer, my family's from Latin America. I kind of appreciate, I have a specialty, I write a lot about books from Latin America, but I also really appreciate my editors who give me stuff that's not from Latin America. I think the flip side of that is, as a critic, you want to have range. Why should every book that Lauren get be from, a particular demographic niche?
It's funny, one of my favorite, actually a Black writer, said to me, "God damn it, you have to stop reviewing white bald guys." Damned if you do, damned if you don't. She said, if you keep doing that, you and Wyatt Mason, another white bald guy, you're going to drive away all of our readers. It's going to seem like all you guys care about is books by people like you.
another issue, of course, in which there's so many things to keep into. You please first. Yes, go ahead.
Thanks. Ethics of long versus short. If you're writing a 300-word capsule review for the Chronicle Roundup in New York Times Book Review or for Entertainment Weekly, are the ethics different than if you have, say, 2,200 words to write for Bob Silvers? And I ask that because, I mean, this question of distillation, I think, is in some ways, for me at least, very important.
No, I don't think the ethics change. And I always kind of bristle when people say, well, you can't do X in a short review. I mean, in some ways, writing the short review is like writing poetry. You have to get it in there. Every word counts. And if we think, if we think we can do that in poetry, why not book reviews? And so.
I think there is a special problem there. If you take a look at the 6 reviews in the New York Times art section this morning of fiction, it's true that you don't have as much space to be unethical in some ways, but one unfair word can actually kill the book. I mean, I know, to my mind, a couple of those reviews were attacking the authors for using cliched language, but the author of the review was using cliched language. And maybe in a longer review, she could have explained that a bit.
I'm surprised, Maureen, that you say that because of course, ideally, we could say, the better we are, the more we can say in fewer words. But most of us aren't that great. And either we have to stop writing short reviews, or we're going to have to shave away certain nuances that really are inappropriate in a very short review. You probably, for instance, shouldn't review your mother's book in a 400-word review. But it could be very interesting in the New York Review of Books to do it in 3,000 words.
I just don't know how useful they are. I'm not sure anyone finds that particularly useful.
That's different.
But even in a long review, there can be some omissions. For example, I've written a long review of Roberto Bolaño's 2666. The translator of that review is Natasha Werner, who's a very close friend of mine. I didn't acknowledge that in the review, and I mentioned it to my editor. It wasn't hidden from the editorial process, but we decided not to put that in. I felt like I was writing about Bolaño, not about the translation so much per se, especially because there was a lot of reporting going on in the review. But I mean, maybe I'll be hung after this panel for this thing. But I just wonder. I mean, the assumption behind the question seems to be that longer might end up having more disclosure and shorter not. And in this case, it was a very long piece, almost 10,000 words, and that was never in the case.
One little issue that doesn't come up on any of the surveys, mine either, is what happens when the editor is actually less stringent about ethical issues than the reviewer. That often comes up, and one thing on this survey that I would recommend when you fine-tune it, because this is something I discovered on mine, is I had asked the sort of dopey binary question: is it the reviewer's obligation to raise conflicts of interest, or is it the editor's obligation? I got so many responses saying, let's make it 2 separate independent obligations. They should both feel obliged to bring up every possible conflict and so on. And so we created a third answer. And I think that is the best answer. Both parties should be obliged to do that.
And I just want to quickly respond to Lauren. I think if you're not that good you're saying many of us are not that good to write the short reviews, you're probably not that good in the long form either. I really do. I mean, from teaching for 25 years, students in English classes, they don't get better when they write longer papers.
I couldn't agree more. I don't mean that the review will necessarily get better as it gets longer. Yeah. I just mean that there might be things that would be hard to do ethically in a short review that are easier to do ethically.
Let's take let's take one last question from the audience. I'm going to get somebody in the back because I'm in favor of people in the front. So you against the wall, please, ma'am. Yes.
I'm curious to know whether anyone from the mainstream critical establishment has approached Amazon in terms of imposing some sort of ethical standards on what is now an increasingly important part of the food chain, or is that good reason for all my
I don't know the
Well, publishers and agents have had a lot of interaction with Amazon about this issue, in part because there's a tremendous amount of abuse in the review section of Amazon, usually politically motivated. So books on the left will be spammed with one-star reviews from the right, and vice versa. Amazon is not particularly overly concerned about it. Their feeling is that they want to be, they have a very simple mission statement, which is to be the most consumer-friendly website in the world. And that's it. They don't, it's not to protect authors, it's not to forward great literature, it's not to aid in the ethical reviewing of books. So your friends, family, and coworkers can feel free to post Amazon reviews, and Amazon doesn't particularly mind or care about that. Obscenity they care about, and malicious, politically motivated attacks they tend to care about. That's about it.
Actually, can I have a follow-up to that? I was always wondering why doesn't Amazon limit reviews to people who have actually bought books? The books are business that have been incented to buy books. From their viewpoint, it doesn't make any sense to let anybody review books, even if you buy it.
You should move to Seattle or Brandon. It's a good idea.
I should ask them. They have to ask them every time. It doesn't make sense from their viewpoint.
Well, I think our time is up, so I would first of all like to encourage any of you who are not members of the NBCC and are interested to become members of the NBCC to see one of us with the ethics committee here. And also, if you have any issues that you think we should be considering for the Code of Ethics, please come and talk to us also. And also, I'd just like to give a round of applause for a fantastic